So last week we looked at the way that Boaz modeled God's love to Ruth, and we saw that at the end of chapter 2 that Ruth continued to faithfully do the necessary work, even while she's exhausted, even while she's already spent all of the day gathering all of this grain that she then has to thresh it, and then she has to gather it all up and march it home so that her and Naomi can benefit from it. And that we saw that the grace of God benefited these women, but that God's grace and Boaz's mercy and comfort and Ruth's work all come together to awaken hope in Naomi. That Naomi has gone through this very difficult time. She's been at one of the lowest points of her life, and all of these forces coming together that are all through the hand of God, able to reach into her heart and waken up hope inside of her. And then she, even at the end of chapter 2, starts to give advice to Ruth and say, hey, you need to do what this man has said, and you need to make sure that you're staying beside his women servants, and you need to make sure that you do exactly as I tell you so that you can be safe and you can accomplish everything that you're supposed to accomplish. So we see that Naomi is not like she was at the beginning of the day in chapter 2, where she just said, if you want to go out and try to gather some grain, you go right ahead and go try to gather it. She just says, go ahead then. She's not giving any input. She's not really interested in trying to give counsel. But by the end, because of all of these people working in her life, she's starting to wake up and say, hey, I have a role here. I'm supposed to be doing something and leading this woman, even as she is serving the two of us. And now we'll see that Naomi is going to be more actively involved in Ruth's life. If somebody could please for us read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 3.
Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you work? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor.
All right, so Naomi starts off with several rhetorical questions as she's talking after this months of gathering that Ruth has done. We're told that Ruth gets to gather not just in the barley harvest, but through the wheat harvest. So as we said last week, we're talking about at least 7 weeks, probably around 2 months, that this woman has been going to Boaz's field over and over again, gathering food and bringing it back home. And she's gone through all of this point, and she waits until the very end of the wheat harvest. And then Naomi looks at her and says, okay, it's time. I'm supposed to do something here. Shouldn't I go out and seek rest for you? And then she asks that other question, isn't Boaz, the one whose women you've been working with, one of our kinsmen? So she waits weeks before she says anything. So why does Naomi think that she needs to get involved now? She waits for 2 months, and then she starts speaking into Ruth's life. Why does she wait? And why does she decide to get involved now? Faith, okay. But why did it take 2 months for her to get to that point? Okay. Yeah. So it takes a little while, right? Okay. Yeah, all right. Any other ideas?
7's a convenient number of
Okay.
weeks.
Yeah, 7's a convenient number of weeks.
Cycle complete.
Sure. Okay. Anybody else? Well, I think it's probably because the harvest is almost finished. That what's happening here is the window is closing. We're told that Boaz is starting to winnow his barley at the threshing floor. And this is one of the last steps of the harvest season. So what that means is that Naomi's probably been hoping that something's going to happen. She's probably been sitting there watching what's going on. And like any mother, she's watching her daughter go into every meeting with this man. And she's thinking, I sure hope they make some kind of connection here. I hope that they decide to move this along a little bit. And every day Ruth comes back and no news. Or if there is news, it's not significant. And I bet you that Naomi is praying at this point. I doubt that she got all excited about Boaz 2 months ago when she said at the beginning of the barley harvest, oh, wait, this man is one of our kinsmen. Surely God is intervening in our lives. And then she decided to put that thought out of her mind. That's not how any of us work, right? When we get excited about something, that stays in our minds, and especially a parent with their child, if they think there's a romantic possibility that will mean something, they're not just going to say, oh, well, I guess that's that. They're going to be thinking about that pretty regularly. They're probably going to be prompting something about that, of saying, so how are things going with Boaz? Everything all right with you guys? Did you see him today? Did Do you have an opportunity to talk? She's probably very involved, I imagine, because Ruth's a daughter to her, right? Precious and beloved. But she's still an outsider living in God's land. She's extremely poor and she barely has a home. And then we have this other concern that the bloodline of Elimelech, her husband that has died, is going to die out if Ruth doesn't have a child, because she's the last connection. Because Naomi cannot have children anymore, and Ruth is the widow of Elimelech's son. So she technically can continue this bloodline. Plus, there's Ruth's loneliness, right? I think every parent of a child could recognize that, of, hey, you probably need somebody other than me. You might want someone, because Ruth's probably only in her low to mid-20s. She says, hey, you're probably going to need to get out there, and you're going to need a person of rest, Naomi says. Now, this word doesn't mean that a woman gets married and she gets to do nothing. That would be really nice for some people. They kind of dream of that idea. I have a relative in my family who kind of dreams of that idea that maybe she'll marry well and she'll just get to put her feet up and not really have to worry about anything. But if you talk to married women, even rich married women, you'll find that there is work in marriage, right? It's not very often that you're going to find a husband who does everything. That would be very unlikely. Even if they provide well, even if they take care of the house well, there's still some expectations of work, right? So this isn't the kind of rest that Naomi is asking for. She's not saying, Naomi, I hope you go find you a man who lets you kick back and put your feet up, and you don't have to do anything for the rest of your days. That's not the dream. As we've said last week, God intended for all of us to do some kind of work. Even if you can't do physical work, He expects you to do something. He doesn't want you to just lay around and eat bonbons. That's not the goal. But this word that Naomi is using, it means a lot more than physical rest. If somebody can look into your translation there in verse 1, where she says, should I not seek rest in my translation? What other words do you guys have?
Well provided for.
Be well provided for. What else? Security. Okay. So that's a pretty decent survey of the kinds of things that this word can mean, because this word really means a lot more than just rest. It also means security and stability. It means rest of spirit, heart, and mind. It means that you don't have to worry about things anymore. It means that once you are married to the right kind of man, a lot of those fears that you might have had as an unmarried woman are going to be put to the side, because you have confidence, because He is going to be God's vessel to you. He is going to provide for you in a lot of ways. If a man is a godly man, there shouldn't be fear of restlessness anymore. The woman shouldn't have to be worried and think, I wonder if anybody's going to be able to take care of me. That shouldn't be a concern to her. She should know that the man will do all that he can to provide, protect, and promote her. But Ruth's a foreign, poor widow in a small town, and she has no other real prospects, right? All she has is Boaz. And so I bet that these problems weigh pretty heavily on these women. Maybe they talked about them, or maybe they were quietly nervous about them. Now, I bet when she first came home with those 50 pounds of barley, everybody was really excited. And I bet when she kept coming home with more of the barley or more of the wheat as the harvest kept coming in, there was some exciting days. But there's also a thought about the future, right? Because if you have this kind of income where you're very seasonal, you're going to be in a bad position once the harvest runs out. Once there is no more grain to glean, no one is likely to provide for these women. They would have to survive all the way until the next barley harvest. And the weeks start to drag on. The end of the harvest is coming. And so Naomi understands the problem. She realizes that she's in a mess, that chaos is still right there at their doorstep. And that's one of the steps that we have to look at from Naomi, is that when you want to combat chaos in your life, you have to understand the problem. When you decide that you're going to do anything about it, you got to get to what the issue actually is. If you think, I'm just going to start fighting, and you don't understand what your enemy is, or you don't understand what the problem is, you're going to do a very bad job, right? One of the things that we've seen in this Iran conflict is that we have very good intelligence in the military, people are very capable of understanding exactly where the target is. And that level of precision is very uncommon in warfare. The history of warfare is normally, we have an enemy, we're going to go kill everyone in the area. That doesn't work very well for Christians because we tend to find that many of our enemies are also people that we care about. We don't want to hurt those people. We only want to hurt the things in them that are opposed to us. And so we see in Naomi this understanding that you need to know what the problem is. Because once this harvest has come in, she probably will have very little reason to interact with Boaz. It would be kind of awkward, right? We're not talking about a society where this woman's able to just drop him a direct message or a text. She has to have a pretext, a reason for why she would have a conversation with this man. She has no other reason to go to his field. She has no other reason to go to his home. And so we're in a real pickle for these women. And Naomi decides that it's time to act. Earlier in chapter 1, she had prayed that Ruth and Orpah would find rest in the home of a husband. And now she says, I'm going to seek rest. It's almost as if Naomi says, you haven't done it enough. I hoped that you and God would handle this, but I think it's time for me to get involved. I think it's time that I need to do some things. And like any good mother, she's done her homework. She knows what she needs to about this man. So she tells her, hey, I know where Boaz is going to be this evening. I've understood it. She's asked around, she's watched, she knows the routine of this man that she wants her daughter to be with. And so we'll see that she has a detailed plan. But that leads us to our question of the week from last week. Did Naomi have to seek rest for Ruth, or would God have handled it? What if Naomi hadn't been involved?
I think I was saying it's fine.
Yeah? Okay.
Who Boaz?
Sure, okay, yeah.
I'm also like that Boaz told the other men we were wrong.
I think you're right. I think he's kind of walling her off.
So she didn't have any other candidates.
Sure. I think that's a good point, yeah. Do you think that God is going to use Naomi in what's going on, or do you think she would have been better to stay out?
No, he does use her.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
You're fine. I thought you were finished. Go ahead.
Is she great grandmother of David?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we know that the result turns out well. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. Sure. And I think that it is a point where we see she's probably very nervous, right? Because of the end of the harvest, because they won't have a reason to talk to each other for a good long time, they need something to happen. And that's where we often get ourselves into a questionable decision, is that we don't know if we should intervene or not, right? Once the circumstances start to really build up, and you get really nervous about something, and you say, God, if you don't come through in the next 3 days, I'm going to do something. Well, sometimes God just goes, all right, yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens.
He's already working through now. Look at that on the right there.
That's right. Yeah. So that kind of puts us into this puzzled situation that the book of Ruth wants you to always be in, where you go, well, what should they have done? What should I be doing? When things come up in your life, should you sit back and wait for God to do something about it? Or should you be more hands-on and say, well, I better get into this because God's not doing enough, or because God's not acting as fast as I want him to, and I got a deadline coming up. That's a really challenging spot for all of us. And anybody who thinks that they can go through their life and always feel comfortable, either in waiting on God or in taking it into your own hands, has probably deceived themselves. Because really, you're going to find yourself on one side or the other of that pretty regularly, where you're going to think, maybe I should have waited. And then other times you'll think, maybe God didn't want me to wait. Maybe I should have acted earlier. And the problem is, God doesn't give you an evaluation of your decisions. He very rarely tells you, hey, I wanted you to wait for the next 6 weeks. Sometimes someone will come and say, hey, God told me to let you know you have to wait. And if that happens, that's wonderful. That gives you a lot of comfort. Even if it's irritating sometimes, it still makes you have something where you can say, I need to wait. But you can find yourself in the position of Abraham and Sarah, right? Where you come up with some kind of scheme and you say, I need to do something. I need to be involved. And then once you get involved, God says, no, that wasn't it. You were way off in deciding to put your hands in there. But he didn't warn them. He didn't come up when they were coming up with this plan with Hagar and say, hey, what are you guys doing? Quit. Put Hagar over there. She's just the servant. She's not going to be the bearer of the promised son. You need to not do this. God rarely gets involved until much later in a way that makes it obvious to us. He makes us wait. He makes us puzzle it out. He makes us wonder because he wants you to grow through it. Because those decisions are really a lot of where you grow. That anxious time where you don't know, should I go left or right? Should I make a move or should I just pause? Those are the moments that are very difficult, but that helps us to remember that God's still involved. Because we can see after the fact that God is involved in something like the story of Ruth. That he is moving when we can't see it. That he is always there. And our storyteller wants us to remember that God has never forgotten you. Even when things are really difficult. Even when we're suffering. And even when we're making bizarre schemes, God remembers you. Even if you've made a terrible mistake, God doesn't leave you. He waits and says, okay, now that you've done this, let's see what we need to do together. The Bible says God is always working in all of our lives. He makes it clear that he gives us the ability to make plans, but that ultimately he's going to do what he thinks is necessary. It doesn't mean God's going to do everything that would have been best, but it means he's always going to do what he knows is necessary in our lives and in our world. So we can trust God that he's not going to let you make a mistake that ruins his big plan. He might let you make a mistake that ruins what would have been best for your life and maybe even the lives of your family, but he will redeem that. Yet, we can rest in the fact that God is going to accomplish his ultimate goals always, because he knows what we are like, because he knows that we are dirt. And when he knows we are dirt, he's not going to put the really big things into our hands and say, oh, well, we could have had a savior, but you guys messed it up. He's never going to let that happen. Sometimes he shows us that he's involved in big, obvious ways. And sometimes he uses our really weird plans. Naomi has a weird plan. It's confusing and it's very difficult. But it shows us that a lot has changed in the months since chapter 1. She felt helpless and empty as she came back to Bethlehem. She didn't realize that she had anything left. And now she sees that Ruth is a God-given resource. God's grace poured into her at the end of chapter 2, and now she gets to work. She gets to work in the way that only older women are able to, planning, and especially matchmaking planning. So if somebody can please read for us chapter 3, verses 3 through 7.
Wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor. Do not make yourself known to man until he has finished eating. But when he lies down in a certain place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at David's feet. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down.
All right. Pretty weird plan, right? So Ruth's beloved Naomi says, hey, Boaz is at the threshing floor. And I have a photo of what one of these in the modern sense would look like. It is pretty much the same thing that you see in drawings for thousands of years. Roughly a flat area, usually with stones on the floor, and usually in a circle. They vary in different sizes, but they're always this basic pattern. And we see that in the Bible, some people own their own threshing floors. They have big enough operations of grain that we get told about several threshing floors throughout the Bible, and they say, this man's threshing floor had this or that happen. But Bethlehem seems to have one that's a communal threshing floor that everybody shares in the town. So we're probably talking about a very large space. Even though we're only dealing with a town of 300 or 400 people, that's still a good amount of farming to be done. If you only have one space like this, it has to be very large. Now, wealthier people would use animals to help to thresh the grain. And I have a drawing here of this where people would load up their little wooden sledges or sometimes stack stones, or even children that we have records of, that they would ride on these little vehicles here, and the animals would pull over the grain and crack the kernels away from the stalks. If you didn't have that, then as I showed in the video last week, you had to beat it against a stone and separate that yourself. But there was the task after the threshing. Once you've separated the seeds from the big stalks, you have to winnow the grain. And we have that going on in our story tonight. That the final step of the harvest is that once you have those kernels all on the ground, you have to scoop them all up. And traditionally in this area, you use baskets that are made out of some kind of plant material, and you're going to throw them up in the air. And it needs a whole lot of labor, because the conditions have to be exactly perfect for this to go just right. You have to have good wind, but not too much wind. You need to have a nice day that isn't very rainy. And so you have to have a time when everybody's going to get together. Once the winds really start to come in, we're told in this area, usually in the late evenings in this point of the calendar, that you would have all of your laborers get together with these little baskets or nets, and they're all standing there up on a higher place, and they're throwing the grain up into the air so that the wind sweeps away the little bits that you can't eat that are still attached to the seed, and then the seed that's heavier falls straight down, and you're able to gather all of this up so that it can be stored or sold. Now, it needs all of these workers to be all in a large gathering. And that gives us a question, because we're being told by Naomi that Ruth is supposed to go on a stealth mission. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever played any of those video games that have stealth missions. Those are usually pretty frustrating to people who like those kind of games. But one of the more frustrating things is when there's a whole bunch of people that are all in one area, and they tell you, you got to go into the middle of that. Because you know that a lot of eyes means that you're very likely to be detected. So Naomi says, everybody's going to be there, but Boaz will. So I want you to sneak in there and get up close to Boaz. So why in the world does she want Ruth to have to go and approach Boaz privately, secretly, in such a public place?
It's a protective measure to make sure that she doesn't get blamed for more than actually happened.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that it's intended to make it clear what's going on. Because if it's a private place like his personal home, and she's going in the night, there's a whole lot more questions, right? There's a lot of questions here, and a lot of scholars, a lot of people who want to make a name for themselves, they try to make what's happening here into something that it isn't. And I think that that's why Naomi and the Lord have Ruth do it where and when she did. Because these people are rightly pointing out that some of these words in chapter 3 can be very suggestive words. We have uncover his feet, lie down at night when he's alone. That doesn't necessarily give us the best picture of what's going on. We're informed that one of the words in Hebrew for foot can refer to sexual organs. And that makes people go, uh-oh. She just told Ruth to uncover feet. And we go, oh, uncover at night? What's happening here? What's Naomi, godly Naomi, doing? Is she really sending her in the middle of the night to go and mess around with this guy? But these words are used very differently when sex is intended. The Hebrew, you need to understand, has two different words for foot. The word that we are using here is one that means the place where he's lying down or his overall legs. So it's more like saying the foot of the man, the way that we would say the foot of the bed. We're not talking about uncovering parts of him that should not be. And one of the definitive markers for me is that she says to her, lie down at his feet, not lie with. If you look throughout the Bible, if you want to have someone understood as having sex, they say they lie with that person. They do not say they lie down at the person's feet. That's just never a phrase that is used in the scripture to mean sex. Now, if we were reading a book from another religion, or maybe some fictional book, maybe we could do that and say, oh, okay, it's really the things in between the lines that you have to read, and you can understand that actually all of these secretive things are happening. But I don't think that's what we're seeing here, because God's word doesn't work that way. We see over and over in the Bible that God is very happy to tell us the embarrassing, disgusting things that go on with his people. He doesn't hide any of that. I can't think of any of the stories where something really questionable happens where God pulls back and shields it from us and says, oh no, you don't need to know that. No, he makes it really clear what has happened. In fact, in a story that has some similar language, but those other words where Lot's daughters are sleeping with him after he is drunk, the Bible makes it very clear they committed incest with their father. They took advantage of their father, intentionally getting him drunk. It's disgusting. And God wants it to be disgusting and say, you should never act that way. But there's no sense where God has something like Ruth and he has this story told and then he goes, oh, well, I'm just going to hide what really happened. Because that's not how God works. Again and again, the Lord tells us when something is sinful and awful. In the Bible, we have rape and murder and incest and child sacrifice. All of those things are just spoken about. So if something like this happened, God would have told us. He has no problem when David makes a mistake and murders someone and has sex with a woman he should have never been with. We have no problem with being told Solomon commits adultery with all kinds of other gods. He marries 1,000 women and he starts worshiping all of their gods, including those that include burning your children alive. So if God's not going to hide that, why would he hide this? It makes no sense to me. The case just doesn't add up. I see no chance that Ruth and Boaz are here having sex on the threshing floor. I don't think that's happening. I think, as Cheryl points out, Naomi was protecting her from that happening. Because if they had done that, God would have told us. God wouldn't have covered that up. We cover up sin. God exposes it. From the very beginning, the very first sin we're told about in the Bible in the Garden of Eden, it's the people hiding, right? The humans make the catastrophic mistake, and then they hide the sin. And then God says, oh no, we're not going to hide. We're going to make it clear what has happened here. And that's God's role still today. That God reveals our sin. That he makes it clear that your sin is going to be public. One of the most frightening verses in the Bible to me is when Jesus says in Luke, that everything you say in secret is going to be shouted from the rooftop. That's scary, right? All of us have said something in secret that we wouldn't want shouted from the rooftop. But Jesus tells you, hey, this is for your good. When you decide you're going to sin and no one's ever going to find out, I'm going to make sure they find out. Because when people know about sin, we get less of it. When people hide sin and they think it's something really exciting and something really fun to do, we get more of it. God wants less sin, and so he uncovers it. So we are sure that this didn't happen the way that these modern people say, but that in fact, it is a still very strange plan, right? Let's say it is exactly what the scripture says. This woman sneaks up to this man, and she is supposed to uncover his feet in the middle of the night, while there's all these other people. Now, Ruth's intent could have been very easily misconstrued, right? Even though she's doing the best version that she can, it's still really weird. She's in the middle of the night, she's approaching this man who's alone, and she's uncovering his feet. Now, at the very least, the negative reaction that Boaz could have had is just get upset, right? He could have just woken up and said, what are you doing? Why are you over here messing with me? You're not supposed to be touching me. I'm just over here sleeping. I'm in charge. Why are you messing with me while I'm sleeping? Or he could have been outraged. He could have thought what these scholars think. that Ruth is coming on to him. And he's an honorable man. So an honorable man, if a woman approaches in the middle of the night and he thinks that she's trying to seduce him, is going to be upset. And he's going to say, no, this is not happening. I don't know what you're thinking you're doing, but you're going to get out of here. Maybe he wakes a bunch of people up and says, hey, this woman's over here and I want everybody to know I didn't do anything. It's a risky plan. Or worse yet, Naomi could have been one of the very, very many people who have misjudged the righteousness of a man, right? We see stories all the time of people who misjudge the righteousness of someone, who think that someone is a godly man, and then the news comes out of what they're really like. When they have the opportunity to do something, when nobody's going to know. It could have been that Ruth was in real danger. That Boaz wakes up and goes, oh yeah? You're here for this? And takes advantage. So why such a weird plan? Why put Ruth at Boaz's mercy alone in the night?
I think she's trying to see the reaction from him.
Okay. Yeah.
And doing it by themselves where they don't embarrass her.
Okay.
Rejection.
Okay. So you think she's trying to seduce him, or what do you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
See what he thinks of her.
Yeah.
Instead of just asking.
Yeah, okay. I see what you mean. Any other thoughts? Okay. Sure, okay.
I don't know. I mean, being at his feet might have been a sign of respect.
Yeah.
Not in a space where she could, get in bed with him or be close to him. I'm sitting here waiting as your servant.
Yeah.
Not throwing herself at him.
Yeah.
Oh,
I got you, TJ. You're all right.
Yes, but I'm happy.
You're good. You're good. I got you, man. Well, I think that this is a crazy idea, but Naomi has a method to her madness. Because it is crazy, but it has a point. That Ruth has made a connection with Boaz. She has this personal connection, right, that she has made with this man. And it's not a romantic connection, but one of social obligation. Now, we will find out in chapter 4, and in just a few verses actually, that Boaz will tell us about another redeemer. And he will say, hey, there's another one who's in line in front of me. We got to deal with this person. Now, as we've said, this is a town probably of 300 to 400 people. No chance Naomi doesn't know about this guy, right? She absolutely knows that he's around. So that then becomes a question of, if this guy's in line in front of Boaz, you don't just get to skip him. You don't just get to say, oh, well, I don't want to deal with that guy, so we're just going to go over his head. But there's a roundabout way that only this woman is clever enough to think up of, well, if you approach him, it kind of changes things. It would be dishonorable for Ruth to be helped by Boaz and skip over him because they've already got this connection. So Naomi says, you need to go to Boaz and offer yourself over to him. Now then that becomes the question of, why didn't Naomi approach Boaz? Why didn't she at least have Ruth approach during the day? Well, for Naomi, it's because she's first in line. And that's a problem, because if she accepts Boaz's marriage, we already know that she can't bear children anymore. So the line is cut off. Also, Boaz has put his kindness onto Ruth directly. So again, we've caused him shame if we skip over that connection. And in the same way, if Ruth or Naomi goes in the daytime, then we're causing Boaz to have his reputation on the line. Because as soon as these women approach in the day, everybody in town knows. Absolutely everybody knows, oh yeah? Did you know that Ruth went over to Boaz? Did you know she had a conversation? Well, what are they going to talk about? There's not a lot of harvesting still left. So it's obviously about romance. It's obviously about their future. And then once people's tongues are wagging, you're going to make Boaz look bad if he says, you know what, I'm really not interested. You're a Moabite. I don't want to do this. And so they're trying to preserve Boaz's reputation. But then we have that preparation. It kind of gets into our mind and makes us wonder about it still. Because Naomi says, you're supposed to wash yourself, you're supposed to anoint yourself, and you're supposed to put on your best clothing. And that makes us go back to, wait a minute. What kind of thing is Ruth supposed to be up to here? She's awfully prepared for a conversation, right? Most girls aren't going to take a bath and put on perfume and change into their best clothing just to have a casual conversation. She might have some sinister motives, people think. It can seem like she's planning to use her charms for seduction. But this is a cultural misunderstanding. If you think that, that's because our culture would do that. Our culture would say if a woman is interested in anything with a man that has romance involved, she's going to fix herself up a little bit, right? But what we're dealing with isn't sexual signals that Naomi's telling her to use, but cultural rituals that everyone else, including Boaz, would have known. This is about the end of mourning. If you look throughout the scripture, what happens when somebody goes into a period after mourning, after they have gone through a very painful death in their life, they put on some kind of sackcloth. They put on some kind of clothing that's dirty, that's disgusting, that's meant to tell everyone else, hey, I'm hurting. I'm really struggling here. And oftentimes they will take ashes and rub that all over themselves to make it even more clear that from a distance, you're not going to call out with a happy greeting and say, oh, hey, Ruth, it's so good to see you. You're going to see that clothing that's all dirty and stained, and you're going to, from a distance, know that woman's really having a tough time. I better moderate how I treat her, and I better do things differently. And so these three acts that Naomi tells her, wash, anoint, change clothing, those things are the ritual of the end of mourning. Once you have done these three things, once you have taken off that sackcloth and anointed yourself and put on better clothing, you're telling everyone around you, my grief is over. That doesn't mean I'm not going to feel sad still. That doesn't mean I'm not still going to miss my loved one. But it means that my life isn't at that lowest point that it used to be. We don't know how long Ruth's been in mourning, but she would almost certainly been wearing some kind of widow's garment. So now she washes herself off, puts on perfume and new clothes to end her mourning. But that asks a question. How come Naomi gets to decide when Ruth's mourning is over? Yeah. So why?
Who normally declares?
Yeah, I think you're right, because it's her son, right? She's in the awkward position that it's her mother-in-law. Yeah, I think you're right. Is that what you were going to say?
I was going to ask who normally declares that. Is it the person's choice or
Yeah.
is it the head of the household?
It's normally the person who decides that. Well, okay, so let me say it this way. That's a good question, because if it's a person who is considered under the authority of the head, then the head makes that decision. So there's kind of a mix of this where Ruth has put herself under Naomi's authority. She said, I'm going to follow you wherever you go. I'm going to do whatever you need me to do. So she has said, you're going to decide a lot of my life. But then there's also this other emotional aspect that you don't want to offend your mother-in-law, right? You don't want to move forward and say, hey, I don't really need to keep thinking sad thoughts. I need to move on with my life. Mother-in-law might not like that, right? She might think, my baby's worth 2 years. We don't know.
But she also told them in chapter 1 that she was praying they found husband.
That's right. So there is kind of this interesting thing where she's told her that, and yet she's still in this mourning way. So how is that happening? We don't really know. Was Naomi ready for her to move on immediately? Had it been months or even years? We don't get told that. All we know is that Naomi says, now it's time. You aren't going to wear those clothes anymore. You aren't going to act that way anymore. You're going to let everybody know that you're not wearing this sackcloth and ashes anymore, but you're eligible. You're changing your relationship status the way that they did 3,000 years ago. There you are. And then, once she's prepared herself for this brave and risky plan, she sneaks up beside Boaz, she uncovers his feet, and she lays down to wait. If somebody could please read for us verses 8 and 9.
Now it happened at midnight that the man was startled and turned himself, and there a woman was lying at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" So she answered, "I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative."
All right. Now we're told there it happened at midnight in some translations, and other translations it says in the middle of the night. And both of those phrases mean the same thing. They come from a Hebrew phrase that really is important in a lot of the scripture, and that even goes forward into the Greek, where we are told in the New Testament that very significant events often happen in people's lives in the middle of the night. That in the language is pretty much the same way that we understand high noon in a Western, right? When somebody says, hey, it's high noon in a Western, you know, what they're telling you is something important's about to happen. They're not really saying we're going to talk about what time it is. When they're saying in the middle of the night, they're saying, pay attention, the really important thing is going to happen right now. And then the storyteller tells us, again, the way that he did in the early part of chapter 2 when he said, and look, there was Boaz. She uncovers his feet. She lays down beside him. He turns over, and we're told, and look, there's a woman. Wow. Can you imagine that scene? That's just so incredible to think about to me, that this man has his feet uncovered. It's apparently kind of still a little bit of a chill in the night. He gets his feet cold enough that he wakes up, and he's probably pretty groggy. He's had a long day. We're told that he's eaten a big meal, that he's been drinking a little bit. He's been celebrating. He's all together with all these people, as only a big group of men can do, and they've been having a rowdy good time. He's exhausted. Then his feet are uncovered. He turns over, and he's getting ready to tuck himself back in because somehow his feet are cold. And look, there's a woman. Now that is a stable and balanced man. Because if my feet were uncovered and I was by myself when I went to sleep, and I woke up and I'm getting ready to tuck myself in, and look, there's a woman, and it is not my wife, I'm going to holler. It is not going to be a moment where everybody is going to get to sleep around me. There is not going to be any question that there is a woman beside me, because I'm going to be very concerned about what she's doing. But Boaz seems to just go, that's weird. There's a woman down there. And he says, who are you? Now, I don't know if this is because there's enough moonlight that he can see her shape and understand that she's a woman, or if the anointed oil that she has put on is so strong that it's like Axe body spray, and you know, oh wow, that's a woman's scent. But somehow in the dark, when he's alone, he identifies there's a woman down there, and then he says, who are you? Which is interesting because in chapter 2 he had said, whose is she? We talked about that and how unusual it was that normally we would say, who are you? Who is she? And this is what he comes out with this time. Who are you? We learn that at this point, she's going to give us the definitive answer to this whole scheme, this whole plan. What's she going to do? Because that's the question that Naomi had put in her mind. Because when Naomi gave her orders, she said, you're supposed to do all this, and when Boaz wakes up, he's going to give you an order. And the order is, who are you? Wow, that doesn't really help. Imagine Ruth's confusion. She says, I'm Ruth. And we find that she's not trying to seduce him. She's not trying to offer a one night of pleasure, but a lifetime of companionship. She introduces a bit of chaos into Boaz's life, right? She's had all this chaos that's been poured over the lives of Naomi and Ruth, and then she kind of spreads that a little bit. She makes some chaos on the threshing floor by startling Boaz, and then kind of introduces chaos into his whole life and says, hey, I want to unmake everything about your life. I want to undo the way things have been going. I want to take apart your old life and build a new one. Now, even today, it's very uncommon for a woman to propose to a man, right? It happens, but it's still very uncommon. But in that era, it's almost unthinkable. It would have been considered very disrespectful to Boaz. Now, by proposing alone at night, Boaz is able to turn her down secretly and say, nope, not interested. Appreciate it, but the town would never stop talking if I took in a Moabite woman as my wife. No one but the three of these people would ever need to know. Now, how do we know this is a proposal for marriage and not sex? Because we see Ruth move herself up the ladder again, as we talked up last week. She last week called herself, after Boaz was kind to her, a maidservant. She said, I'm the lowest of your servants. And now when she says, hey, you asked who I am? Well, I am your servant. And in the English, we lose all that. But in the Hebrew, what she's saying is, I'm your servant, who's also a wife. Whoa. That's a big change, right? It's a bold move to uncover somebody's feet in the middle of the night and say, hey, it's me, your wife. I don't have a wife. What are you talking about? There's no wife here. I'm an old man. I got a lot of stuff, but I don't have a wife. That's what Ruth says to him. And she also uses her personal name for the first time. This whole time throughout the story, she had been continuously saying, I'm this foreigner. I'm a servant. I'm a maidservant. But she says, I'm Ruth. I want to be known as someone who you use the first name of. I want this connection. She's moved herself up the ladder. And then we also have this amazing thing that last week we talked about Boaz saying, or maybe 2 weeks ago, Boaz saying that she had come under the refuge of the Lord's wings. And he said, may God reward you fully, the God whose wings you have sought refuge under. And then she uses this same terminology, and she says, spread your cloak over me. And again, if you know the Hebrew, you'll see that what she really says is spread your wing over me. Exactly the same word. She says, I want you to be the wing of God that you talked about. I want you to take care of me. She tells him that she wants this because he's the guardian, that he's her redeemer. Now, she's put her heart on the line there, right? That's an extremely brave thing. To go into the middle of the night, wake this man up in this really weird way, and then say, hey, I'm your wife, and I need you to protect me because you can be my redeemer. You can be my guardian. That's bold. Well, there you go. Maybe you just got to uncover his feet. They'll get cold. She's done everything that Naomi has asked her to do and has continued to fight the chaos in their lives. And the way that she does it now is by being brave enough to make this request in the form of a statement. She says, will you marry me by saying, I'm your wife? Spread your wing over me. Wow. That's really bold. Now we also find that Naomi has joined the fight against chaos in this chapter because she risked the last shreds of reputation that her family had, right? If Ruth had been caught, maybe people would have agreed with Cheryl and thought, well, surely this isn't a plan to actually seduce Boaz. But I've heard dumber things. People will talk. They'll come up with conspiracies. They'll say, oh, that Naomi and Ruth, they were trying to trap Boaz. They were trying to really get him to do what he shouldn't have done. People make up all kinds of lies. It was a very risky plan. But Naomi knew there wasn't another chance. Unless Boaz is going to act, outside of this harvest season, there isn't another chance. So Naomi pushes the envelope and says, we're going to try to deal with this. And we're going to try to deal with it the way that only these two women are only able to do, because they have no other option. Naomi understood her need, and then she made a plan to address it. But another thing that we have to see she did is understood what tools she had, right? The only thing that she had was Ruth. And we saw at the end of chapter 1 that she didn't even realize that Ruth was significant. She said, I'm empty. I got nothing. And now she sees, wait a minute, I got one bullet left. I can do something about this chaos. I'm going to send Ruth into that threshing floor, and she's going to do this really crazy thing. And we'll see what happens. The basic steps to fighting chaos in our life is to understand what the problem is, and then to prayerfully come up with a plan. Now, I hope it sounds less crazy than this, but you need to come up with something. You need to pray through it and say, God, what do I need to do? How do I need to address this? What should I be doing in this? And what options do I have? And realize your options. Even when you have nothing that anyone else would think mattered, understand that you still have something God's given you. You still have choices that God will let you make. And He's given you the wisdom to make those choices well. He'll provide for you because He's promised He will. And one of the things He's promised is that if you lack wisdom, you should ask, and He will give it. He may not give you the answer. He may not tell you, hey, you need to send Ruth in the middle of the night and go talk to this man. I don't know. Was that God's plan? We don't know. Could she have done something else? We don't know. What we will know is that it ultimately works. And so next week we will study Boaz's response to Ruth's proposal. And our question of the week for next week is, how do you know when you should get involved and when you should wait on God? All right. Anybody have questions or comments?
There was no cultural tradition that this aligned with
Of
behavior.
going in the middle of the night, you mean? Or what do you mean?
Yeah, to uncover the whole thing, what it meant.
There's nothing that is in any way definitive. The language, the way that they use it, it is a unique event. So there are people who will say, because there are other words used and other ways of using those words that mean go try to have sex with someone. As an example, in Lot's daughters, very similar language, but different words. Words that mean other things. And it's kind of one of those challenging things for us that we have trouble with when we get translated that it's the same word. So it sounds like the same event. But if you see that those words are never used that way elsewhere, then you can have confidence that that's not what's being said. And I think your broader point of why would you do that in public? If you're going to try to seduce him, then you wouldn't do that here. There would be a lot better ways to do that. So then the question of, is there precedence for a woman proposing this way? Basically not, because there's almost no talk in any ancient literature of women proposing. That's one of the very special things about this story, is it's so bold, it's so unique, that it's almost incomprehensible that it works out, because you wouldn't have expected it to work out. If you had gone 3,000 years ago and say, what would you think if a woman who you kind of liked approached you in the middle of the night and asked you to be her wife? People would have laughed at you. They would have said, this isn't what we do. I'm not going to do that because I'm a man. I'm the one who decides that. And so it's just culturally something that is not anything we have a record of. I'm not telling you that maybe Moabite women did this, but I would be very surprised because it's Naomi's idea, right? So it would seem, if we know it's not an Israelite tradition. So if it's a Moabite tradition, it's one that Naomi learned in her 10-year sojourn and then brings back. That seems very unlikely to me that that's what's going on.
Well, if it was a Moabite tradition, then Boaz might not catch the significance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that personally, the uncovering the feet is purely a weird way of waking him up that is meant to not startle him. I think that the reason she doesn't come up to him and shake him is so that she doesn't have him scream. I think the plan is all about secrecy and stealth, and she hopes to whisper and trust that he's a man who has more serenity when he's sleeping than I would if I was woken up with a stranger at my feet.
There's no chance I could have been that quiet.
Well, maybe she didn't touch his feet, maybe just the blanket. Any other questions, comments?
Women propose men these days, they people go by their
Okay. But I don't want to besmirch women, because women, there's nothing wrong in our society if that was to happen, if a woman was to propose to a man. It would be unconventional still, but it wouldn't be as unconventional as it would have been then. All right.